So let me tell you how this is going to work. We have a simultaneous interpretation in Portuguese for those journalists who are joining us from Brazil. As a reminder, the report is embargoed until noon today, Washington, D.C. time. If for some reason you don't have a copy of the report, or if you haven't seen it, please just put your email on the chat and we will make sure that you get one soonest. Bill will go through his presentation and then we're going to leave enough time for your questions. If you have a question, please, you can put it in the chat and I will get to it after Bill's presentation. So Bill, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Anna. Let me just share my screen here. Okay. Bom dia a todos. Good morning to everybody. My name is Bill Maloney, and I'm going to present a little bit of the essence of our Latin American and Caribbean Economic Review for October 22nd. As is generally the case, the report is in two parts. The first takes stock of where the region is heading in terms of economics and in social indicators. And the second addresses one topic that's of particular importance to the current situation we're in. In this case, it's new approaches to closing the persistent fiscal gaps that we face as a region. The first question asks, are we back to normal yet? And the answer is yes and no, and for good and bad. On the economic front, we've largely recovered to our pre-pandemic levels of income, but we're facing medium-term growth rates that are relatively weak. It was a very good year this year. In April, we were forecasting 2.3% growth for the region, and in the end, now we're predicting more like 3%, which is a substantial increase, and that's partly due to the rise in commodity prices that we've seen. On the other hand, we're facing renewed headwinds. The impact of the war in Ukraine has been uneven for different countries in the region, but on average not as bad as for other regions. But the higher interest rates coming out of the advanced world, the slower growth in the G7 and in China, and the fall in commodity prices are all leading us to downgrade our forecast for 2023 from 2.2% to 1.6%. The entire world is experiencing that downgrade, so it's not just the region. Nonetheless, these are the factors that are driving it. Of greater concern to us, I guess, is that what we're predicting for 2024 at 2.3% is largely the growth rate that we experienced during the decade of the 2010s, which suggests that we have structural problems in achieving higher growth rates and that we have to keep our eye on the longer term reforms that we need to undertake to raise growth rates. Social indicators have also largely recovered, but there's long-term scarring that requires policy attention. The good news is employment has largely recovered. Poverty measured in monetary terms is largely back down to 2019 levels, especially in Brazil. And then informality has fallen across the board to pre-COVID levels, including for women who are particularly affected during the crisis. The bad news is that 1.5 lost years of education is likely to imply a decrease of about 10% in those students' incomes across the course of their lives. And because those are the children with the least access to internet, more in the poorer classes, that implies a problem of increased equity over the longer term. In the chaos of the pandemic, there was a fall in overall vaccination rates for all kinds of diseases of about 10 to 15 percentage points. And that's going to lead in the medium term to more disease. And food insecurity in some countries, particularly those that didn't have much in the way of transfers to families, has led to stunting, which is of course difficult to remedy. The unwelcome guest in the region is inflation, and we don't know how long it will stay. And of course, it poses difficult policy trade-offs. The median inflation rate for the region is about 6%. Of course, there are some countries, about 3 countries, that are substantially above that for particular reasons. But it's impressive that most of the countries of the region are even below the OECD, are either below the OECD levels of inflation or around them. And that is relatively good news because we're basically where everybody else is for the most part. That's not to deny that the sharp increases in food and fuel prices haven't hit poor families especially hard, and we need to address those from a policy point of view. But the fact is that central banks have been very aggressive by historical standards, and that has both helped keep inflation down, but of course, as is the case everywhere in the world, that also contributes to a growth slowdown. At this point, there's no evidence of rising expectations of inflation, perhaps as a result. The fiscal deficits that we ran up during the pandemic to deal with it remain. We've had a decrease in primary deficits of about 0.96 percentage points, but on the other hand, the higher interest payments are leaving overall deficits high. At this point, of course, the rising interest rates are making it harder to service the debt, but markets remain relatively calm. They're wary, but calm, and we just have to watch that going forward. Over the longer term, limited fiscal space, as we try to struggle with this, is going to constrain the necessary investments in infrastructure, education, and innovation needed for growth. And that leads us to the second chapter of the report, which is, okay, we get more fiscal space. We basically identify three different classes of interventions that we could make to get more fiscal space. The first we want to highlight is sort of short-sighted ways to do this, which will buy us some space now, but will later. The first is cutting public investment, which is always an easy target because there's no constituency today for what's going to give results in 10 years. But you see that Latin America and the Caribbean spends about 4% of GDP on public, compared to Sub-Saharan Africa, East Asia, and the Middle East, which are between 6 and 8%. And that also implies that returns to these investments are very high in our region. So if we want to kickstart growth, this isn't an area where we really want to cut. The other area that we want to be careful of is inflationary erosion of some kinds of transfers, especially pensions. That tends to be regressive, as many pensioners are, of course, not particularly well off, can be vulnerable. It's also recessive because these people spend all that money. A better approach, we argue, is working towards more effective public spending. We estimate that eliminating losses in badly designed transfers, for instance, energy, procurement, and wage bills could save roughly 17% of spending. And that implies that for 2 out of 3 countries in the region, you could basically balance the budgets, more than balance the budgets with those savings. More than that, we see working on better public spending as kind of a gateway to modernizing the state and increasing public trust. And so we see this is all part of an agenda for increasing confidence in the state. Finally, we deal with a lot of the complications of surrounding new taxation. This is obviously a tricky area because it requires balancing revenue, progressivity, and growth. And the last chapter deals particularly with some of the subtleties around that. On the first point, lack taxation levels are moderate by global standards. You can see that from the graph, about 25%, but it varies greatly across the region. In the southern cone, once you adjust for our level of development, we're not so far from the OECD levels. But on the other hand, there are countries in Central America, in particular, where taxation rates are extremely low. High taxes, we know from the literature, can make our economies much more progressive. On the other hand, they can also slow growth. That's what the literature from the OECD tells us. But it also tells us, and the work we do in the report shows, that it depends very much on the level of taxation and the type of tax. For instance, the value-added tax in the region is high. It's regressive. It tends to hit relatively more poor households, and it has negative impacts on growth at very high levels, we show. So we probably don't have a lot of room in the region for increasing there. Corporate taxes are relatively high in the region as well. there's room for simplification that would probably increase compliance. But the new area of focus is on income taxes because they look low on average in the region. And they can be extremely progressive, obviously, because we can tax high income earners more. The things we wanted to highlight is that while the average level of income taxation is very low in Latin America, or is low in Latin America, that's largely because we're only taxing a very, very narrow segment of the population, basically the top 10%, compared to the United States, which is about 80%. And this very narrow focus implies, it probably explains the larger negative effects on growth that we see with income taxes. And part of the conclusion of this is obviously we have to be careful in thinking through these things, the forms, but that we're probably going to have to broaden the tax base if we're going to avoid growth effects. I'll stop there. I want to thank you very much. Muito obrigado a todos. And now to questions.
Many thanks, Bill. Let me just pop the chat up here. And so we'll go in the order we received the questions. Bill, there's a first one from Francois Rothschild from RFM 104.9, who's interested in anything you can tell us about any updates on Haiti.
Yes, Haiti remains a very difficult situation. They continue struggling with multi-pronged crises, and we've got gang violence, we've got lingering political institutional instability, and we've had persistent vulnerability to natural shocks. COVID, of course, exacerbated these, and unfortunately, to date, the region has a very low vaccination rate, leading it to vulnerability to future variants. The economy continues to contract. We're seeing negative 2.5% in 2022, and then minus 0.1% in 2023. So the short-term and medium-term situation is not extremely positive. The bank continues to support recovery from the 2021 earthquake and by strengthening the country's disaster risk capacity, investing a lot in weather resilient roads and bridges and the like. We've also been working hard to address problems of access to quality learning and to mitigating Haiti's growing food insecurity. And for that reason, the portfolio of the bank towards Haiti has increased by about 40% in the last 2 years. But that's about what we have right now. We monitor the situation very carefully, but it remains a very difficult situation.
Thank you, Bill. And we have a few questions on Brazil. So I am going to read them to you. One we have from Esteban Tallar from Valor Económico. How does the World Bank evaluate Brazilian current fiscal conjuncture? How can this new approach help improve the Brazilian current fiscal conjuncture? And then there's another one also similar on fiscal in Brazil from Folha de Sao Paulo. Can you talk more specifically about the fiscal gap in Brazil and why is Brazil constantly growing below the Latin American average? And we have another and a few other questions on Brazil. So do you want all the questions on Brazil?
Sure, put them all in.
Okay. There's another question from Andre Coelho. It's what is the projection for the Brazilian economy this year and next year? What are the best options to impulse economic activity, and how does the World Bank see the election influence on that? And then there were 3 questions from Cicero Cotrim. And I am so sorry, I apologize in advance for butchering anyone's name. As someone whose name constantly gets butchered at the World Bank, believe it or not, I apologize if I am mispronouncing your names. 3 questions. Budgetary room for Brazil investment has been declining sharply in Brazil. Is raising public investment a priority to secure the country's future growth? What would you consider the optimal model for tax reform to be in Brazil? And how much should the decline of commodity prices and the deceleration of advanced economies in China impact Latin America, specifically Brazil? So a few questions on fiscal in Brazil, a few about the impact of the election, one on the impact of the election, the budgetary room, and very much you're on the hook for the optimal model of tax reform in Brazil.
Yeah. that may that may be a longer discussion. Just the basic panorama, we're expecting Brazil to grow.
Yeah.
Sorry, there's somebody on the line?
I don't know where I think it's muted now.
Okay. So Brazil, we're expecting to grow at about 2.5% in 2022, partly due to rebound effects from the pandemic and stronger commodity prices. We're expecting it to slow to around 0.8% in 2023. Brazil is one of the countries that sort of had mixed impacts of the Ukraine crisis. On the one hand, for instance, there was increased demand for certain commodities. On the other hand, there were shortages of fertilizer and the like, which affect the agricultural sector. So it's been a mixed bag, and the country is the regional average is being driven by a couple high flyers like Colombia, but Brazil is pretty much at the median for the growth rates overall. Going into next year, the deceleration, the slowdown in the G7 growth rates and of China, who is a major export partner, and the decline in commodity prices, and of course the sharply rising interest rates in the United States are going to hit the entire region. It'll hit Brazil hard as well. Despite the fact that Brazil was very generous during the pandemic in providing transfers to families. In fact, it was one of the few regions few countries in the region where poverty actually decreased during the crisis. And there, of course, was a sharp increase in debt as a result of that. The overall fiscal situation in Brazil is not it's not especially difficult by regional standards. So as with the other countries in the region, we have to watch the impact of rising interest rates and debt service payments, but we're not in an especially bad position in Brazil. As far as the election, we've worked with both governments that are likely to, with both the Bolsonaro and the Lula governments in the past, and we'll, work constructively with whoever is elected. We have a long list of agenda items, and the growth issue, which was mentioned here, how to get these growth rates higher. That's going to be a preoccupation of any government, I think. Increasing inclusion remains a longstanding issue in Brazil, and increasingly effective climate action. We have a long agenda in Brazil to work on there. So why don't I leave it there?
Bill, and sorry if I'm clunky, I just have to open the chat. So just to come back, you want to say anything more about this last part of the question from Agencia Estado about the potential impact that the declining commodity prices and the deceleration of China would impact the region? It was about Brazil.
Yeah, so I don't know. I don't have, it's hard to pinpoint exactly what the impact would be on Brazil, but obviously we're a commodities exporter, and so the decline in China's growth, which looks to be quite low this year, historically low, will have impacts on the Brazilian economy, and I think that's baked into the relatively low 0.8% that we're expecting in 2023.
Thanks, Bill. And then there's a question from Peter Richards of the Caribbean Media Corporation. Can you talk more specifically about your projections for the Caribbean?
Yeah, so the Caribbean was one of the regions that was hardest hit by COVID. GDP still hasn't recovered to its 2019 levels, and we're not expecting that to be the case until 24, and that reflects the overall slow rate of recovery of the region. Part of that is we know many of the islands are very tourism dependent, and we had a hard time getting a handle on COVID. And many countries of the region are still with vaccinations around or below 40%, which leaves us vulnerable to whatever new variant comes. It's important to realize that COVID is in recession right now, but it's very unpredictable, and we have to be prepared for whatever's coming, and that means those vaccination rates we want to rise to buy some resilience. The other thing is that the region was hit especially hard by the Ukraine crisis because we're net food and fuel importers for the most part, with perhaps the exception of Trinidad and Tobago. And so that put additional strain on household budgets and on government finances. So this has been a very difficult couple of years for the Caribbean. The bank has programs for I think 19 countries in the region. We've been focusing precisely on issues of fiscal sustainability, building resilience to natural hazards. I think right now our portfolio is like 3 billion or something like that for the region.
So sorry, and I just realized I was unmuted. Apologies for that, Bill. So we have another question. From, let me just go in order. Sorry about this. Sorry, a question from the Trinidad Express. You referred to eliminating losses in transfers. Does this mean eliminating subsidies on fuel and food to things that impact low income families the most? And
okay, go ahead, please finish.
No, go ahead. You can answer that and then I'll come to the next one.
Yeah, okay, that's why I said poorly designed transfers. Obviously, we've got many families that have been hit very hard by higher energy prices and higher food prices. But often what we find in the region, in all of Latin America, is that we'll just subsidize oil prices or fuel prices across the board, which means we're not only helping out those poor families, we're subsidizing fuel prices for the entire population, including those that don't need it. And so that savings we're talking about is precisely the gains that would be gleaned from better targeting those kinds of relief efforts. So it's not about eliminating all support to families. It's probably better from an economic point of view to not subsidize these products directly, but to increase transfers to vulnerable families. And that's probably more efficient from an economic point of view. But again, to reiterate, we're not talking about eliminating support to poor families who are hit by these higher prices.
Thanks, Bill. There's a question from Javano Keys from Television Jamaica. A number of countries in the region have tightened monetary policy with the private sector expressing concern. Would you say the concern is warranted, and at what point would be too far for central banks to push up interest rates?
Yeah, so that's the Goldilocks question. We have to be completely honest that the tools we have for combating inflation are not fine instruments. Okay, raising interest rates works on inflation precisely by reducing aggregate demand, reducing demand for products. That's how they work. So the art of this, and this is a big debate in the United States as well, is you want to raise interest rates enough so that people see that inflation is under control and that expectations aren't rising. And in fact, in the region, Latin America right now, inflationary expectations are not yet rising. And that's partly due to the aggressiveness of the central banks of the region. But you want to raise them enough to do that, but not to drive the economy into recession. And that is the Goldilocks problem that central banks have across the world. I would say that overall, the region has been pretty good at maintaining that balance.
Thanks, Bill. There's a question from Sam. There are a few questions going back to the Caribbean, more specifically about certain countries. So I'm just going to read them and see if you can respond. There's a question from Sam George from TDN Network, who's asking about the economic outlook for the Eastern Caribbean. Do you have anything specifically of that, including Dominica? And then anything specifically on Jamaica? I think if you can repeat I don't know, the outlook for the Caribbean region, if you have something.
Yeah, actually, I don't have those numbers in front of me right now. Let me pull them up. Sorry. Actually, I don't know if you have somebody over there who has them.
Okay, so why don't we, while we
move on.
while we get them to you, we can come back to that in a second. There's another question from Jermaine Bell from Open Media One. Caribbean islands such as St. Kitts and Nevis are dependent on the CBI programs in the region. What is your position on this program, and how can it fill the gap in the economic rebound? Should countries like St. Kitts and Nevis move away from being predominantly government spending? And what is the economic state of the OECS member countries? And just a comment for any of you, if we're not able to answer your question now because we can't, because Bill doesn't have those numbers in front of him, we will email you the specifics right after the press conference. But Bill, you have a response for the question from St. Kitts?
So yeah, the CPAs are a very interesting instrument, and I don't know that we fully thought about them. They play a very large role in some countries at this point. I don't think I have anything to comment in particular. Let me see, what were the countries we were looking for? We were looking for St. Kitts.
We were looking for Jamaica, OEC, the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, OECS, and
Okay.
we were looking for Barbados, I believe.
So Barbados, we're looking at 10.5% for this year, which is quite good, and then falling to 5% next year. For Jamaica, we have 3.2% for this year, and then falling to 2% next year. And the OECS, I don't think we have as a group broken out here.
Dominica, what do you have?
Dominica, we have 5.8% this year and 5.0% going into next year.
Okay, thank you. I have another question. Someone is asking if you can please repeat the projections for 2022 and 2023 for Brazil, because they did hear them.
Yeah, so we're expecting 2.5% in 2022 and then 0.8% in 2023.
Thank you. A question in Argentina. Inflation is accelerating. What is your outlook for the coming months? Is there a risk of spiralization?
Of what, sorry?
Spiralization. I'm not pronouncing this very well, but like it will spiral down.
Oh, spiral. Oh. So obviously in Argentina is...
Sorry, spiral up, not down.
Spiraling is fine. So
about spiraling down. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so obviously Argentina is one of the countries in the region with higher inflation rates than the median that we talked about, that 6%, and that has been the case for several years, and it remains a concern. We are hopeful that the IMF program that they've got, the $45 billion program, will stay on track. We are supporting that program with another $2 billion. And of course, as much technical assistance as we can provide. So we just have to stay the course and see how it comes out.
I have another question for you from Nisha Paul from the New Today, Grenada. Small island states have been calling for a multidimensional vulnerability index in terms of the criteria for accessing concessionary loans and grants to support their development and mitigate against the various challenges like climate change. Is this something you see happening in the near future, and what is the role you see for the World Bank in this regard?
So just because I have the number, Grenada is going to grow at 3%, and we're predicting 3.8% this year, falling to 3.4% next year. I think the Caribbean islands in general would benefit from working as a group on these kinds of issues and making their case to the advanced countries. So articulating the concerns and working as a group would be a very positive thing. The bank stands ready to discuss these issues on a variety of different levels.
Give me a second, I'm just accessing the chat. So the next question is, despite the fact that inflation expectations are under control in Latin America, inflation expectations for 2024 are on the rise in Brazil. Is this a concern for Brazil? Should this be a concern for Brazil?
Yes, I mean, well, let's put it this way. The good news is that so far, for the most part, inflationary expectations have been moderate, but is exactly, again, this balancing act that central banks have, that they want to, when you see this incipient rise in people's expectations of inflation, you want to take a credible response to signal to the citizens of the country that no, you've got inflation under control and that inflationary expectations should stay low. You don't, obviously in the longer term, you don't want inflationary expectations to rise and then get built into wage negotiations, which in turn push up prices. We want to avoid that kind of wage spiral, and that's a concern in the United States, and that's a concern everywhere.
Thanks, Bill. I have a couple of questions on Guyana. The first one is from Sultana Marshall of the News Source. The budding oil sector and COVID have in part contributed to an increase in inflation rates in Guyana. What measures can be implemented to cushion the impact? Also, some leaders have recommended cash transfers per household. What's the World Bank's position on this? And then a separate question on Guyana that says, Guyana is still feeling the impacts of inflation, but projected for significant economic growth due to the booming oil sector. How will the country be impacted, I assume, by any increase in inflation?
Right, so obviously Guyana's been having astronomically high rates of growth. Let me see if I can have that number right here. Guyana, we're expecting 57.8% this year, falling to 25%, 25.2% next year. That's an economy those are extraordinary growth rates reflecting the development of this new sector in Guyana. And that's going to, and any government would have a challenge in managing those resource flows to be sure that you didn't set off inflation within the country, and the central bank will need to take measures to control that. And as far as how to mitigate the impact on families, in general, the bank has supported transfers to households to offset the rising fuel and food costs as a more efficient way of supporting poor families than, as I was mentioning earlier, blanket subsidies.
Bill, do you have the specific number for St. Kitts?
We don't have that number. St. Kitts, and that's strange, but yeah, I don't think we have St. Kitts.
Okay, well, we can. And there is a question from Television Jamaica. Should the region be concerned about the possibility of a recession?
So if it helps, St. Lucia and St. Vincent we have, and St. Lucia is going to be 7.9% this year and then 6% next year, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines is going to be 5 and 6.3. So that gives you a feeling for how the islands in the area are doing. Jamaica, worried about a recession. Jamaica is doing, we're forecasting 2.0% for next year, which is above the regional average. Of course, these are estimates, so things can go wrong, but at present, we're not predicting a recession.
Thanks, Bill. And we have a question from the Caribbean Broadcasting Corporation. Barbados' estimated growth rate is notably higher than most other countries in the region. Why would you say this is? I just want to remind people, if you have any questions, please post them. I think we're going to be wrapping up if there aren't any other questions. So, Bill, why do you think Barbados is growing the way it's growing?
I do not have the answer. What I would say is Barbados was very quick to vaccinate overall. So its tourism industry recovered quickly. But aside from that, I don't have a diagnostic on that.
So Bill, I don't see any more questions. I'm going to just give it a couple of minutes to see if anyone has anything else. But I also wanted to give you a chance, Bill, to just close what are the, coming out of the report and looking at the region, going forward, how do you're feeling about it?
So I guess I'd want to say that the region has faced incredibly difficult times over the last couple of years. We were hit second hardest in the world by COVID overall, and then the Ukraine crisis has hit some countries especially hard. So that said, the responses of the monetary authorities and the governments of the region have in general showed a lot of resilience. I mean, in terms of the overall reserve positions of central banks, in terms of the composition of debt, and in terms of the response to inflation on the part of central banks. We've faced a set of very difficult circumstances, I think, much better than we would have 20 years ago. And that's something to be glad about, how we've progressed in that dimension.
Thanks, Bill. And I see two more questions have popped up. I'll go from the more straightforward one to the not so much. So the first is, what is your prediction, your growth prediction for Trinidad and Tobago?
Trinidad and Tobago. Let's see. We have. How do we not have Trinidad and Tobago? We don't have it. Okay, we'll have to look that up. Okay,
we have the name of the reporter. We'll get back to you with this. And then another question from Brazil. How does the World Bank see the optimism of the market with Brazil, and how can this be good for the Brazilian people?
So it's actually impressive that the global markets are, in general, approaching the region with a wary eye, but at this point without alarm. And they've been, if you look at the increase in spreads on emerging market bonds, there's been a slight increase across the board in the last year as interest rates have risen, and markets are acknowledging the increased difficulty we'll have in debt service, but they're not especially high by even recent historical standards. So overall, as we know in financial markets, these things can turn really rapidly. But overall, it's good that markets at this point are not alarmed. It means that country premia are low and are relatively low, and that means that financing our debt is not as high as it might have been in other circumstances, and that helps us with growth.
Thanks, Bill. I don't think we have any more. Oh, yes, we have one more question. What is the outlook for the Bahamas, considering that it had to deal with COVID and Hurricane Dorian in 2019, which cost billions of dollars in losses?
Yeah, Bahamas, we're looking at 8% growth for 2022 and 4.1% for 2023. Yes, Bahamas has had some bad weather, but they're doing relatively well this year.
Thank you, Bill. So I think we're going to wrap this up. I think we owe a couple of reporters some projections. If we can get them to you, we will make sure that we do a couple of additional housekeeping. Just remember, please, that the report is embargoed until noon DC time. If you in the chat, just posted that the contact for Yuri in our team. If there's anything here that wasn't answered, just please reach out to Yuri. He can get you the report, the press release, or he can also follow up on anywhere where you think we need additional clarifications. Just want to thank Bill again for joining us this morning, and to all of you in the region. Thank you so much for your questions, and have a great day.
Thank you very much. Muito obrigado.
Goodbye.